Evelyn had always been fond of antiques. A collector at heart, she frequented local estate sales, looking for treasures lost to time. One foggy afternoon, while browsing an old shop nestled on a forgotten street, she spotted it, an innocuous little painting tucked in the corner of the room. The canvas was small, perhaps no bigger than a dinner plate, framed in tarnished gold and painted with the image of a woman in a flowing dress. Her face was almost obscured by the shadows, but Evelyn could make out dark eyes that seemed to follow her wherever she went. The shopkeeper, a stooped old man with a raspy voice, noticed her interest. "Ah, that one," he said with a strange glint in his eyes. "It's a rare piece. Not many know about it. Some say it has peculiar qualities." Evelyn laughed, thinking it was some old salesman's trick to raise the price. Still, something about the painting intrigued her. Its simplicity, its mystery. She agreed to buy it, dismissing the warning as just superstition. That night, she hung the painting in her living room, right above the fireplace. The dark eyes of the woman seemed to settle on her as she ate her dinner, but Evelyn thought little of it. She was used to the disquieting gaze of portraits from her collection, but there was something different about this one. As the days passed, strange things began to happen. It started with the faint sound of whispers at night, low, unintelligible murmurs that echoed through her empty house. Evelyn tried to brush it off as the house settling, or perhaps the wind, but the whispers grew louder. Soon they came even during the day, rising from the direction of the painting. She could never understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, urgent, full of sorrow. Then came the nightmares. At first, they were nothing more than vivid dreams, but as the nights wore on, they became more real. Every time Evelyn closed her eyes, she would find herself in a dimly lit room. The woman from the painting would stand in the corner, her dark eyes glowing with malice, her mouth twisted into a silent scream. Evelyn tried to scream herself, but no sound would come. She would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart racing, convinced she had seen something in the room, something watching her. One night, Evelyn couldn't take it anymore. She stood before the painting, determined to confront whatever was haunting her. The whispers were growing unbearable, and the woman's eyes seemed to glimmer with some hidden knowledge, as though she was aware of Evelyn's presence in a way she shouldn't be. She reached out and touched the frame, feeling a chill seep into her fingertips. At that moment, the whispers stopped. Evelyn pulled her hand back, heart pounding. The silence was unnerving, but before she could take a breath of relief, something cold brushed against her cheek. She spun around, but no one was there. The room was empty, save for the flickering candle on the mantel. A sudden, sharp pain shot through her hand, sharp enough to make her gasp. She looked down to see blood trickling from her fingers, though there was nothing to explain the wound. Her pulse quickened as she stumbled backward, feeling the oppressive presence of the painting grow stronger. The woman's eyes were no longer just watching her. They were demanding something. Before Evelyn could react, the floorboards creaked behind her, and she turned to find a figure standing in the doorway. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with sunken eyes and a twisted smile. "The painting," he rasped, his voice dry as dust. "She never lets go once she's chosen you." Evelyn tried to scream, but her throat closed tight. The man stepped forward, his fingers brushing the edge of the canvas. "The curse is passed through touch," he whispered, his face contorting with dread. "Once she marks you, there's no escape." Evelyn's vision blurred as the whispers grew deafening. She reached for her phone, her hands trembling, but the man's words echoed in her mind. "Take it back," he said. "Get rid of it before it's too late." But it already was. In a panic, Evelyn shoved the painting off the wall, knocking it to the floor. The woman's eyes still burned through the glass, glowing now with an unnatural light. The whispers intensified into shrill cries, filling the room with terror. Evelyn felt something tug at her chest, as if an invisible hand were pulling her closer to the painting, pulling her into its depths. The man's warning rang in her ears, but it was too late. The room seemed to warp around her, the walls bending and stretching as the shadows of the woman twisted and writhed like living things. Evelyn screamed as she felt herself being drawn in, the canvas reaching out for her like a trap closing shut. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the woman's face, now fully visible, smiling cruelly. Her dark eyes seemed to say, "You're mine now." A week later, the shopkeeper found the painting back in his shop, resting quietly in the corner as if nothing had ever happened. The woman's eyes were as dark and knowing as before, but there was something new this time. A small piece of paper had been slipped under the frame with a hastily scrawled note. "You can't escape. She will always find you." The shopkeeper read the note, his lips curving into a grim smile. He had seen this happen before, and he knew someone else would be drawn to it soon. After all, there was always someone willing to take the risk. When Ava and Ethan's parents told them they were going to visit their estranged grandparents, neither of them was particularly excited. Their mother had never spoken much about her childhood, and the few vague details she shared painted the grandparents as odd, almost reclusive. But as their parents seemed eager for a break, the siblings reluctantly agreed to go along. The journey to the cabin was long and winding, through dense forests that seemed to swallow the sunlight. The GPS had no signal, and the occasional cracked sign pointed them further into the woods. Ava, the older of the two, checked her watch anxiously. It was getting late. They arrived at the cabin just as dusk began to settle over the landscape. The house stood isolated in the trees, old and weathered, its dark windows like eyes watching them approach. Their grandparents, Edith and Samuel, greeted them with tight, uncomfortable smiles. There was an awkwardness in the air, like everyone knew a secret they were too polite to share. "Make yourselves at home," Edith said, her voice too sweet, her hands cold as she hugged them both. Samuel gave a gruff nod, not quite meeting their eyes. The house smelled musty, the kind of scent that clung to forgotten places. The first night was uneventful but eerie. The walls creaked and groaned, the fire crackled in the hearth, but something about the atmosphere kept Ava awake. Every shadow seemed too long, every floorboard creaked a little too loudly. Ethan was asleep, oblivious to the unease settling over the house. At dinner, Edith and Samuel spoke in strange, cryptic ways. "You're just like your mother," Edith said to Ava, her gaze lingering a little too long. "You're bound to understand one day." Ava didn't know what that meant, and Samuel's chuckle made her skin crawl. After dinner, the grandparents excused themselves early, heading up to their rooms without another word. Ava and Ethan tried to relax, but neither of them could shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air was thick with silence, and it wasn't the peaceful kind. That night, the noises started. Low murmurs, the sound of whispers coming from upstairs. Ava lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, trying to ignore the sounds. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing in the dark. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, though she couldn't make out any words. Then there was a knock at the door. Ava froze. It wasn't their grandparents. They would have knocked first, like they did earlier when they had asked them to help with the dishes, but this was different, urgent, insistent. The door creaked open, and before she could react, Ethan's voice called from the hallway. "Ava! Ava, come quick!" She rushed out into the hallway, finding her younger brother standing near the stairs, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he asked in a voice that was barely a whisper. Grandma and Grandpa are... They're not in their room. Ava felt a chill crawl up her spine. What do you mean? Ethan pointed to the stairs. I looked through the crack in the door and I saw them, but it wasn't them. His voice broke off. It was something else. Ava grabbed his arm, dragging him toward the stairs. We're getting out of here, she said, though a knot of fear had already settled in her stomach. They crept down the hallway, trying not to make a sound, and paused near the top of the stairs. The house was eerily silent, the only sound their shallow breaths. The door to the grandparents' room was ajar, and through the small opening, Ava could see shadows moving within. Without a word, they slowly descended, the wooden stairs creaking beneath their feet. When they reached the bottom, they slipped toward the living room, where the strange noises seemed to be coming from. As they moved closer to the source, the air grew colder, the whispers turning into low, guttural voices that seemed to come from everywhere. The room was dark, lit only by the flickering flames of the hearth. Ava's heart pounded in her chest as she spotted movement in the shadows. Then she saw them, Edith and Samuel. But they were no longer themselves. The grandparents stood, or rather hunched, their eyes dark and hollow. Their skin had an unnatural pallor, and their bodies seemed to shift as if they weren't entirely solid. The whispers were emanating from them, their mouths moving in sync with the voices. The couple swayed almost hypnotically, their movements unnatural. Ava's breath caught in her throat. The thing that stood before her wasn't her grandmother nor her grandfather. It was something else, something ancient, something terrible, and it was not alone. Run! Ethan's voice broke through the fog of terror that had gripped her, and they bolted for the door. But as they reached the entrance, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping them inside. Leave the house, a voice hissed from behind them. Ava whipped around, but there was nothing. Only the cold, unnatural presence of the entities that had once been her grandparents. Leave before it's too late, the voice warned again. Panic surged in Ava's chest. She grabbed Ethan's hand, pulling him toward the back door. But as they neared it, the room shifted. The walls seemed to bend inward, as though the house itself was alive, trying to close them in. Where do we go? Ethan cried, his face wet with tears. Ava scanned the room, desperately searching for an escape. Her eyes landed on the window. It was small, but it was their only chance. Help me, she cried, tearing at the window frame. In that instant, the walls groaned again, but this time it was different. There was a tremor in the house, like something was breaking free from deep within. The whispers turned to shrieks, and the floor beneath them shook. A massive crack appeared in the wall, splitting open like a wound, and then, in the chaos, something shifted. The air lightened, the pressure lifting. The unnatural force that had gripped the house seemed to dissipate. The window popped open, and Ava shoved Ethan through it first, pulling him into the safety of the night air. The moment they were out, the house seemed to collapse in on itself, the twisted, dark shape of their grandparents fading into nothing. They didn't look back. The next morning, the authorities found the cabin empty. No sign of Edith and Samuel remained. The only thing left was the eerie, crumbling structure, as if it had been abandoned for years. Ava and Ethan never returned to that place. But years later, when they spoke of it to others, they would always make one thing clear. They didn't leave just because it was strange or spooky. They left because they knew, deep in their bones, that the house had never been home to their grandparents. It had been a prison, and the things inside had been waiting. They were free now, but they would never forget.